Right, we'll make a start. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this RM2 webinar about employee ownership trusts, and in particular, an attempt to correct some of the misconceptions that we've seen out there in the market about EOTs. One of the fastest growing exit routes now for private company business owners for reasons to do with succession planning and also enticing tax relief for vendors of private companies. My name is Nigel Mason, and I'm one of the directors of RM2. And I'll be taking about 30 minutes to go through this webinar, and I'll make sure there is time for questions and answers. So that's me. So here are the 5 myths which we've heard as we speak to business owners and prospective clients for employee ownership trust work. And we'll cover each of these in turn, starting with value that can be obtained from an EOT sale, questions of control and protection, questions of the management team in a business and whether they are carved out of EOT participation, whether or not all this is worth the candle and whether employees will appreciate the end result, and finally, whether these things cost a fortune to implement. So let's just start with fair value. And I couldn't resist getting in a quote from one of my comedy heroes. Thank you, Mr. Cooper. So, value. The most important thing, of course, is that trustees of an employee ownership trust mustn't pay more than market value for an asset, otherwise they would be in breach of their duty to the beneficiaries of the trust. But in an EOT transaction, which isn't market tested, there's no auction taking place, what's the value of the company that's being acquired by the EOT? Well, the theoretical value, perhaps the purest definition of value, is that it's the present day value of future profits that the company will generate. But of course, these future profits are completely unknown. One can take a view, but it's not a very reliable way of establishing present day value. So instead, we would tend to adopt a traditional estimating method, and in the case of a private company, one would almost always start with an enterprise value approach, which involves looking at a company's EBITDA, earnings before interest, tax, depreciation and amortization, and looking at comparable companies in the same sector and of the same size, which have recently been sold, and choosing an appropriate comparable multiple to apply to EBITDA. So let's just run through a little example, and let's assume we've got a company which is generating normalized and maintainable EBITDA of £1 million. And let's assume that, having done some benchmarking against other transactions in the sector, we think the company in question can support an EBITDA multiple of 5.5. That would give an enterprise value of 5.5 million, to which we then need to add any free cash that's sitting on the company's balance sheet that is surplus to its trading requirements and its working capital requirements. So here we've got an assumption of £1.5 million of free cash. We actually find it's quite common for private companies to hoard cash. Obviously, they take a relatively prudent view of life. They don't want to have to resort to external equity funding. And so we tend to see pretty substantial and conservative cash reserves being maintained, but which arguably are over and above what would be needed to get the business through a rainy day. So here we've got £1.5 million of free cash. We've got no debt in the business. Again, this is a conservative company. So we've ended up with an equity value in this example for an EOT acquisition of £7 million. Compare that to what a trade buyer might offer this same company. Well, we've got the same EBITDA number. A trade buyer might be prepared to offer a higher multiple of that EBITDA, in this example 7 times, because it would expect to extract synergies from the acquisition. Synergies would either be cost savings, which would very often take the form of some rationalization and redundancies, or it might take the form of revenue synergies. But usually a trade buyer is not willing to give a vendor the benefit of its own revenue synergies in future. But let's say we've got a bullish trade buyer willing to pay 7 times, giving an enterprise value of 7 million, add the same free cash of 1.5 million, we get a higher equity value of 8.5 million. So at face value and at first blush, it looks like a trade bidder is going to comfortably outbid an EOT. But let's just see how the EOT is going to be financed. Well, it needs to, in total, raise enough to pay the selling shareholder, the £7 million. It also needs to budget for transaction costs, which we've estimated here at 175,000, because we've got some third-party finance that's going to be introduced into this transaction, and the costs of raising third-party finance for a business with EBITDA of £1 million are slightly disproportionate to the amount raised. But so let's take a prudent budget of 175,000. Where is that money coming from? Well, we've got the free cash on the balance sheet, which can be distributed via the EOT to the vendor, which would be free of tax if an EOT is a qualifying trust. We're going to raise some senior debt from a bank equal to 2 times EBITDA, so £2 million. The balance owed to the vendor and to pay for transaction costs is going to be set up as junior or subordinated debt that will rank behind the senior debt in every respect. So finance which is repayable, but which has many of the characteristics of equity. So looked at from the vendor's perspective, they are going to receive not only the initial free cash that is on the company's balance sheet and that's surplus to requirements, they're also going to receive a further £2 million because the company is prepared to borrow 2 times EBITDA, that's the senior debt, from a lender such as a bank, so that the vendor is going to receive £3.5 million up front. It's going to receive the benefit of the junior debt repayments. It's also probably going to receive interest on the junior debt at a premium to the interest that would obtain to the senior debt. So I've very crudely assumed £700,000. And finally, because the junior debt is risk-bearing and ranks behind the senior debt and is unsecured, any commercial lender would expect to have their return sweetened with the issuance of some kind of equity instrument to give them a little bit of a stake in the further growth and upside in this company. And we've assumed in this example that the equity warrants given to the junior debt provider, in this case the vendor, is going to yield £1 million, and that would only be extractable once the buyout finance has been fully repaid. So in grand total, the vendor is going to look forward to just shy of £9 million worth of proceeds, of which the first 2 elements, cash and junior debt repayments, would be capital gains tax free if the vendor is selling his or her entire holding to an EOT, and the interest and the value of the warrants is going to be probably income taxable. Meanwhile, that rival trade bidder, which did offer a higher upfront value compared to the EOT, it may well be able to offer more cash up front to the vendor, and we've assumed 5 million in this example, which, by the way, is likely to be taxed in the hands of the vendor, who may qualify for entrepreneur's relief, but nevertheless it won't be tax-free. And in addition, as is very typical with a trade buyer, they are going to make 3.5 million of their promised 8.5 million conditional on future performance, and they're probably going to expect the vendor to remain tied to the company for a period of years in order to deliver that performance. So the 3.5 million is by no means a guaranteed sum. It's entirely a function of future profits, and therefore what at first sight looked like a superior value offer, in fact, is not only less tax efficient, but is also more dependent on future performance than the EOT offer. So, of course, situations vary enormously, and one has to do a case-by-case deep analysis, but the general principle is that there is no reason why an EOT couldn't deliver a very positive offer to selling shareholders that would compete effectively, if not in every single respect, with a trade buyer. Myth number 2, I'll lose control. And Elon Musk is in the news at the moment, so I thought we'd like to see his perspective on control, which he might feel he's losing at the moment from Tesla. Of course, an EOT does involve a sale of a majority holding. So on one level, yes, control is being given up, and the legislation is unambiguous about that fact. But there are various other ways in which a selling shareholder would retain some residual influence or protection if they are still exposed to risk, which they would be if they were waiting for some of their consideration to be paid on deferred terms. And on this slide, I've just shown a very typical governance structure for an EOT company. So let's just start with the middle section, the company board, and I've just highlighted the vendor as a sort of the figure in black. Let's just assume that the company board consists of the selling shareholder and 3 other executive directors. There is no reason at all why the management structure, including the lower down internal operating structure of the company, need change straight away. Of course, there may be good arguments for it evolving to include more employee input, but on day one, for reasons of continuity and stability, there is every reason why a company's own operating board and executive board remains unchanged. So we still have the vendor as a director with all the duties and responsibilities, as well as access to information that company directorship entails. But now, sitting above the company board, in place of the original controlling shareholder, we've got EOT trustees. And in nearly all cases, EOT trustees are set up in a special purpose vehicle in a bespoke way for each individual EOT company. In other words, it's relatively rare for professional trustee companies to act as the controlling shareholder of a private company. We nearly always see local bespoke arrangements put in place. And in this example, we've got 3 trustees, one of whom could well be the vendor trustee. Although, of course, in that capacity as a trustee, the vendor must always act in the best interest of the beneficiaries and must set aside his or her own interests in any trustee decision. The other two trustees might include an elected employee from the company, and possibly either another member of the board who's not previously been a shareholder, maybe a management successor, or an independent person from outside the company. Companies are free to choose their own trustee arrangements that work best and fit best their own culture. And then meanwhile, on the left-hand side, of course, the vendor is protected to a large extent by the sale and purchase contract, which is entered into between the vendor, the EOT, and the company. So that will include the usual protections for any selling shareholder. And if the selling shareholder is accepting some consideration on deferred terms, there will also be a loan agreement. It may well be part of the sale and purchase agreement. It may be a separate instrument, which might contain various repayment provisions, covenants, the ability to step in if loan repayments are missed, and possibly also a security or charge document giving the vendor security over the company's assets. So although the vendor is relinquishing majority shareholding with all the rights attached to majority shareholding, there are still several ways in which a vendor can be closely involved in a company so as to protect their interests and to provide continuity. Myth number 3, my management team will miss out if we do an EOT. Incidentally, G.K. Chesterton was a follower of a philosophy called distributism, or an economic ideology, which promoted the concept that the world's productive assets should be as widely owned as possible. So if he were alive today, he may well be a big fan of EOTs. An EOT can be both a management buyout and an employee buyout. Of course, fundamentally, it is an employee buyout because a company becomes majority owned by a trust that must operate for the benefit of all its employees. But there is nothing to stop management or selected employees subscribing for new issue shares or being granted options over new issue shares in the company soon after a shareholder has sold a controlling interest to an EOT, so long as the effect of that new issuance of shares or the granting of options doesn't dilute the EOT's holding below the all-important 50% threshold, which would have pretty adverse consequences if that were to happen. So we have been involved in a number of projects which in their early stages were heading towards a classic management buyout outcome, but where the vendor and the company and the management team were persuaded of the merits of a more inclusive EOT structure in which the management team would still benefit to the tune of a substantial minority holding, could be up to 49%. And one very interesting detail in the EOT legislation is that it's possible for a company controlled by an EOT trust company to operate tax advantaged share schemes such as EMI or SIP or a company share option plan. These tax advantage schemes would normally not be possible in a company controlled by another company such as a trust company, but there is a carve out which is very helpful, which allows us to make awards under tax advantage schemes to selected employees or all employees if that is attractive. Myth number 4. What's the point of doing an EOT? Because I'm not sure the employees will appreciate it. Well, there is a substantial body of evidence now from many countries around the world, but especially from the UK and the USA, which show that employee owners become more engaged in the company's business and prospects. I've just cited a couple of statistics from a study done by the London School of Economics for Computershare in 2014, which found from a very large sample that employee owners are more likely to be satisfied with their company than non-employee owners, and they're more likely to believe that their company is a good place to work. And those differences in the percentages that you see there are statistically significant. And I could have found hundreds of other data points from other studies around the world which point to the same conclusion, that employee owners are more engaged. It's not an automatic result, it's a result which has to be worked at. Employees need to see their ownership translate into a degree of involvement and participation, but where that is practiced and where employees are formally as well as informally involved in a company's business, then there's no doubt that employee engagement follows. And then from employee engagement, other good things follow. So it has been shown that employee owners are less likely to take unplanned absences. They're more likely to provide discretionary effort, such as work voluntary overtime. They feel more loyal and are less likely to be looking elsewhere for another job. And in some trade sectors, I would say in an increasing number of trade sectors, employee ownership is no longer an option for a business. It's becoming the norm. The most in-demand and talented people now fully expect to be offered an equity stake in the business that they work for. So ambitious firms can no longer treat this as some kind of optional feature. It's becoming an essential feature of the remuneration package. And if all these things come together, then it has been shown from, again, a number of different studies, of which I've included some sources at the bottom of this slide, that employee-owned firms are more sustainable and more resilient through economic cycles. There's also studies from America which show that sales growth and employment growth are consistently stronger in American ESOP companies, that's employee stock ownership plan companies, the US equivalent of the EOT, if you like, especially where there are well-developed systems for employee involvement and participation. And overall, employee-owned firms have higher productivity growth. In our own study, which we do on behalf of the Employee Ownership Association, we compile an annual list of the largest 50 employee-owned companies in the UK. Many of those are EOT companies, and we look at the productivity growth year on year in that cohort, and we have shown consistently that productivity growth in the top 50 employee-owned companies outstrips productivity growth in the economy at large, which, as we know, is somewhat stubbornly flat and something which is exercising the minds of many policymakers and economists. Finally, myth number 5, it's going to cost too much to implement. Well, an EOT transaction involves less risk than most other types of transaction. It's a non-adversarial arrangement. It's negotiated between a willing buyer and a willing seller, and there are almost always professional advisors such as us involved, acting for the company and making sure that arrangements are in the best interests of the company, which is not quite the same as, but very closely aligned with what's in the best interests of the employees. So I would say that the extent of duplication, the extent of adversarial negotiation is significantly lower, if not barely existing in a typical EOT transaction. There is still a necessity to perform some due diligence because, after all, the EOT trustees are buying a controlling interest in a private company. But it's possible to do that with a light touch because the EOT is not using its own independent means to effect the transaction. It's going to be relying on future company profits. And therefore, usually EOT trustees can take a slightly different view of risk, a slightly more bullish view of risk than would be possible for an external and arm's length buyer. It's also possible, we believe, to take a lighter touch approach to warranties and indemnities. We've nearly always got a situation where a selling shareholder is still significantly exposed to risk in an EOT business because they are owed money, and that money ranks behind other commitments of the company. So there is almost an inbuilt protection for an EOT company, because the vendor is exposed to its future trading performance in exactly the same way as an EOT, or at least in a very similar way. So overall, there is low execution risk. But these things, of course, still need to be thoroughly researched, thoroughly sensitivity tested, and there is a degree of legal work involved in drafting trust deeds, sale and purchase agreements, loan documentation, changes to the articles of association, shareholders agreements if there are minority shareholders, charge documents if security is being given, property conveyancing if there's any reorganization required before an EOT takes place. But overall, when asked the question, how much does it cost, we say to an inquirer to budget around 2% of enterprise value as a good rule of thumb. It would be more than that for a very small transaction where EBITDA is significantly less than £1 million, or where there is third-party finance to be raised. But a good starting position is 2%, and we think that that compares very favourably with the typical transaction costs associated with a trade sale or a sale to private equity. In both those cases, it's the company ultimately which is going to have to underwrite those costs, even though technically they are partly for the account of the buyer. So that concludes my short webinar. I hope that has given you 5 different insights into EOTs from the point of view of value and control, from the point of view of management and employees, and finally from the point of view of cost and project management. I am very happy to take any questions which you may have, if I can operate the control here to find them. Failing that, do please send an email to me at the address shown, and we will also be following up with a little survey monkey to ask you for your feedback, because we run these webinars roughly once every 2 weeks, so it's a pretty active program, and we want to make sure that we keep with relevant topics. So I'm not seeing any questions. Oh, wait a minute, I do have a question. Let me just see if I can reveal it. This may have been covered in previous webinars, which I've not seen, but I'm wondering, please, how the EOT funds the future loan repayments. If via dividends from the target, then are these taxable? That's a good question. The funds flow is that the company makes not dividend payments to the EOT, but gifts or contributions, which are not taxed as dividends either from the company's end or in the receiving hands of the trustees. It's simply a gift, a contribution, which is made from post-tax earnings. So these contributions are not tax deductible. And of course, they can be partly structured so as to require a certain minimum level of contribution to be paid, so that the vendor gets a certain minimum senior debt repayment profile, and then the balance would tend to be entirely a function of company profits and performance. But the answer is, it's not a dividend, it's a contribution. Let's see if I can find any other questions. I think that's the only one we've got for the time being, so I will sign off, because we're committed to keeping these short and sweet. And thank you for your time, and do please stay on our list so that you can receive invitations to future webinars. Thank you very much.